Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. Guys, I mean, I have a real kind of, like, I don't want to say self-hatred, but, like, every now and then I'll make a video and I'm about to upload it and I feel like it's just a piece of crap. And I feel like, oh man, I'm losing it. I'm not myself. I'm not doing too well. And then sure enough, I upload it and you guys dive in, week out, every week without fail. And you give me a reason to make another video. I mean, I know other YouTubers say this all the time and it is something of a cliche, but guys, it really is true. I wouldn't be able to do this without you guys.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to my 2000, yes, you heard that right, my 2000 subscriber Q&A. Guys, I have to say, I'm awestruck. I mean, I've always had a belief in myself, and I always kind of felt like, you know, with time and effort that eventually the channel would take off. But I don't know, it's a weird thing because I've had this unwavering belief in myself, which is what's kept me going, along with the support of you guys, of course. But I don't know, even though I've always felt like if I kept working hard at it and kept just uploading week after week after week, even though I felt that that would ultimately lead to some kind of success at some point, I still can't quite believe that I'm at this juncture. I don't know, I'm sorry if that sounds bizarre or if that sounds contradictory. I don't mean it to sound that way, but I guess I'm just in a state of disbelief. I'm so incredibly honored. Thank you so much for your support. Anybody who's watching this video, thank you so much. And, you know, if you've been a subscriber for a long time or if you've just joined me today, whatever the case may be, however you have supported me, whether it be that you've watched one video, whether this is your first, if you've ever dropped a like in a video or commented, or, you know, if you went a step further and became a patron, and an extra special shout out to you guys, my unbelievably generous and supportive patrons. Just guys, thank you so much to all of you. And look, I'm not going to just inundate you with gratitude, albeit you deserve it. You deserve it so much. This video should just be 30 minutes of me on my knees just saying thank you, thank you, thank you. But I don't imagine that that would make a very entertaining video. So with that said, I wanted to make this video about you guys, and as many of you will have noticed, over the past few weeks, several weeks if anything, I don't know how long it's been, I have invited you guys on various community posts and as a comment on various videos, I've invited you guys to submit your questions for this 2000 subscriber Q&A. So what I'm going to do, guys, over the rest of this video is answer your questions, because I want to make this video about you guys. I wouldn't be here without you. Again, thank you from the bottom of my heart. And so without further ado, I'm going to dive right in here with the very first question. And the first question in this 2000 subscriber Q&A, I'm just gonna have to say that so many times. The first question comes from Darkness2368, and Darkness writes, and I quote, "Hi Dara, it's been a while since I've commented, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the beginning of certain religions." So, needless to say, this question was quite general, so I followed up and asked Darkness, "You mean religion in general, or would you like me to comment on a specific one?" To which Darkness replied, and I quote, "Specific ones, like how you believe Christianity came to be if God doesn't exist, but I'm still very open to hearing your thoughts on religion in general. So thank you, first of all, Darkness, for submitting this question. It's a fascinating question, if I do say so myself. But diving right in, I mean, the problem, of course, is that it's not really possible to answer this question for every religion. That could be an entire series of videos. A person could do a PhD on any one denomination of a specific religion in terms of how it began and so forth. So let me just give you some general thoughts how religion began. I want to make it clear here before I make any of these comments, however, that I am hypothesizing here, because I think the true answer, with the exception of some of the more recent religions, I mean, we know how Scientology got started, for example. But if you go back further, if you go back to Christianity, if you go back further still to Judaism, you go back further again to some of the more ancient religions, it's not exactly clear how every religion began. Let's just take Christianity to get started, right? So my understanding, guys, about the beginnings of Christianity, I mean, I'm not a historian, you have to remember this, but of course, the Christian story is that it got started because there is a God and Jesus's ministry, the Son of God, spreading the word of God, or himself, or whatever view you have, depending on whether or not you're a Trinitarian. That is obviously the Christian view. As far as I'm aware, generally speaking, historians agree on the historicity of Christ. They agree that there was a guy called Jesus Christ wandering around the desert at some point 2,000 years ago, and that may have been the genesis of the religion that is Christianity. Again, I don't have a strong view in this, to be honest. For me as an atheist, it's quite irrelevant as to whether or not Jesus was a real person. That doesn't change the epistemological calculus for me at all, really. If indeed there was a guy called Jesus and he did claim to be the Son of God, that doesn't mean that his claim was true, and it doesn't mean that Christianity is real or that its claims are valid, right? Valid or sound. So yeah, it really is irrelevant to me as an atheist in terms of the origins. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go with the consensus on the historicity of Christ and that's how Christianity got started. I think we have a pretty good idea about Islam as well. Muhammad was a real historical figure who spread the religion. Some would argue with the sword. Muslims might argue in defense of wars. Whatever your view there, again, beside the point. None of it convinces me about the truth of the claims within the Quran or the Hadith or anything like that. I don't think Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse, right? I think if you go back to the origin, though, how did religion get started at all? Why is it that wherever we find pockets of humanity on this planet, why is it that we always find some form of religion? Albeit, I read recently that that's not actually the case, that there have been tribes that have been discovered that don't have any concept of God, but I'm not intimately acquainted with that story or that tribe or any of the information surrounding it, so I'm just going to couch that there as something I heard as hearsay. So please don't quote me on that. I'm not suggesting that is a demonstrable fact. I'm just telling you about something I've heard there. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that the idea of God or religion is near or entirely universal. Fine. Where does it come from? I think my hypothesis is incredibly unoriginal, but it probably has something to do with our fear of death and the terrible circumstance in which we find ourselves on this planet. I mean, come on. Life in 2022 can be fine for some people on some of the surface of the planet. In the Western world, I think we have it pretty good. But if you're born in sub-Saharan Africa or in a very impoverished part of India or something, it's not surprising to me that you might comfort yourself with tales of an afterlife or tales of eternal justice and seeing your loved ones again. And we're just talking about 2022 right now. I don't think it's an accident that the most developed parts of the world happen to be, in many cases, some of the most atheistic parts of the world. It's because if you have it quite good, if your existence in the here and now is rather heavenly, then you have no need for a heaven. Again, these are all just hypotheses. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, but these are some things that I find to be persuasive. If you go back in time, however, when every human basically lived in a state of privation, again, I don't think it's surprising that people came up with stories to comfort themselves. I think the evolutionary psychology is quite clear here, right? So as human beings, we have an unwavering trust in our parents, especially when we're children. We see them as authority figures, and one can very easily see why there's a evolutionary purpose to just have a an unquestioning trust in your elders. Because if you don't trust them, you die, of course. The human beings who didn't trust their elders in the past didn't make it this far, so they never passed on their genes. When your loved ones tell you when you're a child, don't put your hand in the fire, or don't jump off the cliff, or make sure you wash your hands, or, you know, make sure you avoid that poisonous, venomous snake over there. When you get told all these things, if you don't take them seriously from the word go, then you die. You touch the poisonous snake, or you walk off the cliff. Right? You know, don't run with scissors, or don't run around in the dark because you could fall into a pothole, break your ankle, or worse still, you could walk off the edge of a mountain, right? All of these things require that we have an absolutely unquestioning belief in the authorities of those above us. Now, if those people believe in magical ideas, if they have supernatural beliefs, you as a child, you're not going to be able to differentiate between the kind of, you know, don't jump off the cliff, keep your hand out of the fire, and make sure you pray to God. I think it's quite clear. I mean, again, this is a hypothesis, but when I say it's quite clear, I think it's quite clear that that is a possible mechanism for why religiosity is ubiquitous, or why supernatural beliefs are ubiquitous, why they're so common, why they're so universal. I think it's just the case that we have built into us a mechanism for trusting claims that come from on high. Because if we didn't have that mechanism, we wouldn't have survived. If we had a mechanism that encouraged us to distrust what our parents tell us, then we couldn't possibly survive, because we wouldn't listen to the good advice that they have for us. The problem is that it means we're also going to listen to the bad advice and the bad suggestions and the bad beliefs and the, you know, evidentially bankrupt claims that our parents tell us. And, you know, such is life, but the software works well enough for survival, so here we are, right? So again, I don't think that's a groundbreaking or original insight. I don't think that, you know, is going to blow anybody's socks off. I think it's a very well established evolutionary based and psychological based explanation for the universality of religiousness. Again, I think it just comes down to our psychology, evolutionary psychology and survival psychology. We're just supposed to trust from on high, and those on high, because we have a fear of death and because we like to be comforted and so on, they're likely to give us some ideas that are perhaps not true. One other thing I'll say on this, and I must credit Richard Dawkins with this explanation: we evolved on the savannas of Africa, again, for survival. And so when we hear a rustling in the bushes behind us, we don't assume it's the wind very often. Just like when you're in a house all by yourself and it's midnight and you're watching a horror movie and you hear something creak upstairs, you get a fright. In other words, your evolutionary self is kind of assuming an agency, or that there might be something dangerous up there. Jordan Peterson in the past, while I'm not a big fan of his, used the example of putting your arm into a dark room and just wait and see what happens to your psychology. So you're standing in the hallway, the room is completely dark. Just put your arm into the room and kind of close the door on your arm a bit and just wait and see what happens to you, psychologically speaking. And, you know, the truth is you'll begin to feel very uncomfortable and frightened. And there are again good evolutionary and psychological reasons for feeling those fears, right? And when we hear that creak in the house or something go bump in the night, the reason we get a fright is because we're going to assume agency. We're going to assume that there's something out there that's going to hurt us. Go back to Richard Dawkins' example. You hear the rustling in the bushes behind you. Is it better to A, assume it's the wind, or B, assume it's a lion? And obviously it's better to assume B, because if you assume B and it is a lion, you survive. If you assume A, well, you have a chance of survival. You can run away, right? Whereas if you assume A, that it's the wind and it's actually a lion, you're definitely going to get eaten. So one can easily see how this psychology could present itself through natural selection over time, because those that made the wrong assumption got eaten. Those that made the right assumption got selected for by natural selection. So we have this apparatus in our psychology, it seems to me, where we can, or we will, and tend to assume agency when we hear things or when we see patterns. And so when one assumes agency, you're not too far away from assuming some kind of a god, right? You're not too far away from assuming a ghost when you hear a noise, Remember, if we're evolutionarily programmed to believe that there's an agent behind us that's going to hurt us, but then we turn around and there's nothing there, but we still heard the noise, again, you can see how you're not very far away from assuming something supernatural there, that there's a ghost, or that there's a demon, or that there's a god, right? So there's a lot of different features, and one final one that I'll detail, and I think this is the most common, our propensity to assume that correlation equates with causation. So human beings, it just seems to me, have a great difficulty with dealing with coincidences. We don't like the idea that something could have been just a coincidence. We don't find it persuasive as an explanation. And any of you who have been watching my videos for a very long time will have no doubt noticed this coming up again and again and again when it comes to the fine-tuning argument or the complexity of life and all these kinds of things. Theists will ask us to just accept the intuition that this has to be an agent. There must be an unmoved mover or an intelligent designer who's moving all the dials to make it all happen. There's no way at all that it could be a coincidence, right? This gets to the root of another faulty mechanism that we have in our thinking. We just completely rule out the possibility of coincidences. Now, how does this get us to a god, you might be wondering? Well, you know, in times gone by, it might have been more common to see the rainmaker throw his hands up into the air, and then moments later it starts raining and the crop is saved, right? But people forget that the previous 900 times the rainmaker threw their hands up into the air, it didn't rain. But that one time where it worked, people are going to say that the rainmaker must have made it rain, right? The same happens with prayer. Oh, I prayed for someone's illness to go away, and it did. So therefore, it must be the prayer that created the change in their state or in their well-being, right? We, again, just completely rule out the idea of coincidence. You forget the fact that on the day where you made that prayer and the thing happened, there were millions of other people who prayed for things and they didn't happen, which points powerfully in my mind in the direction of coincidence, that, you know, you were just among the lucky few who, when you did pray, it happened to coalesce with the cure that your loved one achieved, or that your loved one managed to come by, which is fantastic. I'm very happy when people get better, but to attribute the wellness to prayer is obscene. But again, people will just reject the idea of coincidence. And because of our psychology and the way that it works, again, this produces religiosity. All you need is a coincidence where somebody prayed to a god and then the thing they asked for happens and suddenly they're a committed believer. I think this happens quite a bit. I myself was a victim to this kind of thinking when I was still a theist. I prayed one day for signs from God when I was struggling with my faith, and that very same day my favorite song came on the radio, and I thought that this was a message or a sign from God reassuring me, I am up here, Magic Skeptic, I'm looking out for you, I even put your favorite song on the radio. And it's just an obscene kind of thinking, isn't it? I mean, for somebody else listening to the radio that day, that was probably their most hated song. So did God just not give a shit about them, right? So look, that's a very long answer, Darkness. And again, all of this is just, you know, all of these explanations are just hypotheses. I can't say for certain why religiosity is ubiquitous and why it has such universality. These are just some explanations that I find persuasive. Do I have incredibly solid empirical data to support these explanations? No, not so much. But I'm just answering the question because it's a fun one to think about. I hope, dear listeners, and I hope, Darkness, that this, you know, rambling of mine on where religiosity comes from and why it's so prevalent has been beneficial. I hope it has given you some insight into my thoughts on the question. But you must remember that I'm simply standing on the shoulders of giants. And so, yeah, nothing too original here in terms of my thinking about where religiosity comes from. But that gives you some sense of my thoughts on the question. And with that said, Darkness, thank you again for submitting the question. And I'm going to move on to the next one. The next question comes from one Cormac Murray, and Cormac writes, do you think Catholic Ireland will survive the next 10 to 20 years? And if so, how do you think at this stage it's just a rotting corpse waiting to go? Thanks again, great video, lad. Thank you very much, Cormac. Cormac submitted that question in reaction to a video that I uploaded a number of weeks ago, so thank you very much for the positive comment there, Cormac. But going back to your question, it's a fascinating question, and one can only hypothesize as to the answer. Do I think Catholic Ireland will survive the next 10 to 20 years? I think so. I think Catholic Ireland is definitely in a state of decline. I think the last number of referenda demonstrate that. So for those of you who aren't from Ireland, you may be unfamiliar about what Cormac is referring to, but Ireland, guys, maybe this won't be a surprise to any of my international listeners, but Ireland for the longest time was in the absolute stranglehold of the Catholic Church. The amount of power that they had in Ireland was obscene, and the abuses that they engaged in and how they wielded that power is despicable, and it's a matter of record. And I'm not going to get into the macabre details because it would just come between you and your night's sleep. If you're interested in looking up the gory details of what happened in Catholic Ireland, just be warned, it's a pretty grim story, but all of that is available on Google and YouTube if you're interested. Whether or not Catholic Ireland will survive the next 10 to 20 years, I mean, I think it will. I think it's undoubtedly in a state of decline in Ireland. So the last number of referenda, there was a blasphemy referendum about abolishing the blasphemy laws. That's right. Up until very recently in Ireland, it was actually still illegal to blaspheme or to say anything negative about God. But thankfully, the populace voted by a significant majority to get rid of that law. The other referendum was the gay marriage referendum, which again was a landslide victory. And the other one was the women's right to choose referendum, and again that was a landslide victory, and women now have the right to choose in Ireland. And these are all amazing and positive developments which demonstrate that the morality of the Catholic Church is no longer the dominant cultural and social force in Ireland. So I think that's what Cormac is driving at. Cormac has no doubt noticed that Catholic Ireland is in decline and that Ireland is becoming an ever more secular nation. But the problem, Cormac, if that is indeed what you're assuming, is that the Catholic Church still has a stranglehold of the education system. Last I checked, and I checked this very recently, the Catholic Church is still the patron of 90% of the schools. And as the old saying goes, the battle for the mind begins in the cradle. And the Catholic Church knows this better than anyone. And as long as they have a foothold in the schools, and being the patron of 90% of those schools, they're able to control the curriculum in those schools, and they're able to enforce a Christian and, or more specifically, a Catholic ethos. And they are doing that. It's the reason that I don't teach in Ireland, Cormac. For those of you who aren't aware, I am in fact a secondary, or what Americans might call a high school teacher. And the reason I don't teach in Ireland is because they expect religion teachers, and I am a religion teacher, yes, despite being an atheist. Remember, you don't have to be a Nazi to teach Nazism, you don't have to be a criminal to teach criminology, and you don't have to be religious to teach religion. So with that addressed, let's move on. But the reason I don't teach in Ireland is because when I went to interviews, I was asked questions like, how are you going to bring children to the Lord? To which I said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to teach the children about what Christians and Catholics, or Christians, or more specifically Catholics, or other types of Christians like Protestants or Southern Baptists or whatever. I'm just going to teach them what they believe. I'm going to teach them what Muslims believe. I'm going to teach them what Jews believe. I'm going to teach them what Hindus believe, etc., etc. A basically kind of comparative religion approach, an academic study of religions approach. But of course, schools in Ireland don't want that, because they're still enforcing a Catholic ethos in many of the schools, in the vast majority of the schools. There are Christian crucifixes hanging on the walls. There are nuns and priests dressed in holy garb, or holy orders as you might refer to it as, and they are officiating ceremonies and conducting school-wide prayer services, and all of this stuff is still going on in Ireland, despite the multicultural, multi-ethnic, despite the religiously plural society that Ireland has become. And so change in this domain is still being fought for by pressure groups like Atheist Ireland and others, and there are various human rights watchdogs that have reprimanded Ireland on numerous occasions because of this. But just getting back to Cormac's question, and I apologise, Cormac, I digress, but it is for this reason that I'm not convinced that Catholic Ireland is going to dissolve in the next 10 to 20 years. I don't think it's the rotting corpse you seem to be inferring that it is. I think it's going to live on for quite a long time, and to be honest, I think it's ineradicable in some sense. As long as, it's funny, funny that I answered the previous question first because it ties in. As long as the psychology, the evolutionary psychology that I'm talking about continues to be relevant, as long as it continues to be a dominant feature in our thinking, I think religion is here to stay. I don't think it's eradicable. I think it might very well be intrinsic to human nature. And so, yeah, when I say intrinsic to human nature, before all of the apologists jump on my back, you say, see, magic skeptic, even you acknowledge that religiosity is natural and that it's baked in and that we have a God-shaped hole. Not quite. I think we have an irrationality-shaped hole. Religion is as ubiquitous as belief in ghosts is. You must remember this. Right? Religion is as ubiquitous as belief in witches and the paranormal and demons and all sorts of other woo, horoscopes and zodiac signs and just utter hogwash and nonsense. So I think as long as human beings have an irrationality-shaped hole, I think religion is here to stay, and that includes the Catholic Church, I'm afraid to say, Cormac. But that doesn't mean we can't fight the good fight, my friend, and I'm grateful that you're along for the ride, and perhaps with your support my channel can reach more people, and maybe we can deconvert more people, maybe we can convince more people of the truth. And another reason why I'm incredibly grateful for all of you guys joining me on this journey. It's incredibly humbling. So thanks very much, Cormac, for submitting that question. Let's move on to the next one. The next question comes from Big D, and Big D writes, question 1, is it bad that I can't think of any questions? It's not bad at all, Big D, and to be quite honest, it's not your fault. Remember, I'm a determinist. You have no control over what your next thought is going to be. If you want to hear my thoughts in depth on the topic of determinism, guys, you can jump into my back catalogue. I've made a very extensive video where I laid out my thoughts in full on the question of determinism, compatibilism, free will, or the lack thereof. But yeah, it's not your fault, Big D, if you cannot think of a question. But luckily, Big D followed up with the following question and said, sincerely, congrats on the 2K. Well, thank you, Big D. My question is, which religion do you think is the most dangerous and despicable? Well, Big D, you certainly like to submit the controversial questions, don't you? Trying to get me demonetized, is it? This is a tricky question, I have to say. It is a tricky question, and perhaps you'll appreciate my answer and perhaps you won't. I'm going to say right now that the answer to this question about which religion is the most despicable, it depends on the historical context, but it also depends on the topic. So if you were to go back to the time of the Crusades or go back to the time of the medieval period, I think it's undeniable that the church, the Christian church, was the most despicable version of religiosity, the most despicable manifestation of religiosity, right? So at the time of the Crusades, Christianity was a brutal force, right? And they enjoyed just unbelievable power, and they wielded it with just an iron fist, right? And so, you know, I don't need to get into the gory and brutal details of what Christendom was getting up to in the medieval period. I'm sure you guys are all very well abreast with that information, but suffice to say, in the past, Christianity was undoubtedly one of the worst religions because it had the most power, and it was quite totalitarian in its use of that power. I inferred earlier about the grip that the Catholic Church, even contemporarily, that the grip that that church had in Ireland was just unbelievable, and the things that they did with that power, the body count and the sexual crimes and the just both verbal the verbal, psychological and physical abuse that was administered by people in holy orders. Even just my parents' generation, just one generation back, my dad, who I'm going to have on my podcast at some point, shout out to you, Dad. My dad could tell you some stories that would make your toes curl of the abuse that he suffered at the hands of the so-called Christian brothers. But I'm going to have him on. If you would be interested in seeing that podcast, by the way, jump into the comments below and let me know, and I'll get my dad on sooner rather than later to tell his story. But that is definitely something that I'm planning on in the coming weeks and months. A bit more of a expose type video where we go into the story of an abuse survivor, that being my dad. But yeah, the power that the church wielded throughout history, even contemporarily and recently, it's just unbelievable. And what they're doing in Africa right now at the moment, where they preach that, you know, AIDS is bad but condoms are worse, to a population that in some places is ravaged by the HIV virus. I mean, it's just unbelievably immoral. And yeah, to even just preach the no condoms or no contraception in a part of the world that has a birth rate that's far too high for the poverty that's there. These are just absolutely wicked teachings and wicked practices. So, you know, the Catholic Church is pretty high up on my despicable radar, but of course no conversation on the despicable nature of religion would be complete without a reference to Islamic fundamentalism, which obviously is, I mean, what else can I say, but it's in the nightly news, right? There have been far too many terrorist incidents carried out in the name of Islam, and, you know, planes flying into buildings and suicide bombings and all that kind of stuff. And that's obviously incredibly unpleasant as well. But let's just leave terrorism aside. Just look at the statistics of, you know, Muslim majority countries and what they believe and how they're influenced to believe certain things by their faith. Yeah, I did a video on this recently when I was reacting to Muhammad hijab. If you want to check that out, please take a look at my back catalogue. It's part 2 of my Muhammad hijab expose. But some of the statistics on the beliefs that are not just a minority, but in fact mainstream in the Middle East, would just, again, they make your toes curl. The kind of things that people believe about homosexuality, the kind of things that people believe about chopping off the hands of thieves, and whether or not a woman's word is worth half that of a man's, and so on. These are all despicable practices as well, in my view. But like I said, it does depend on the topic. So I mentioned about the woman's right to choose earlier. Christianity is the number one impediment to that in the world, and makes Christianity the most despicable religion when it comes to women's rights. Islam is off the hook on this one because they don't believe that life begins at conception. Depending on which hadith you consult, it's many days into the pregnancy. I don't have the factoid offhand, but if you're interested, you can Google it. Whereas many Christians and Christian nationalists in the United States specifically believe that life begins at conception, and so they've had Roe v. Wade overturned in the United States just recently, which kicks the right to choose back to the various states. And because of trigger laws, many people in the United States have just lost their right to choose. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. So really and truly, Big D, I have to say it does depend on the topic. If you want to talk about a woman's right to choose, I think it's clear that Christianity is the worst religion. If you want to talk about terrorism that's happening in the world today, I think it's clear that we have to give that crown to Islam, given the number of incidences that have been inspired by fundamentalist readings of the Quran and the Hadith and so on. And so, yeah, it really does depend on the topic. It depends on what area you want to focus on, but suffice to say, there's a lot of despicable practices being carried out by different religions and different groups. It just depends on the topic, and it depends on the historical context that you want to focus on. So I hope that gives you some sense of my thoughts on what religion is the most despicable. But just before I pass up this question, before I let it go, I think it's important to mention as well that not all religious believers are the same. And, you know, this is a kind of a platitudinous comment, but I do have to say it. I mean, many of my loved ones are Catholic, and they voted against the Catholic Church's position in Ireland on all of the referenda that I just mentioned. I am, you know, personally acquainted with so many religious people, whether they be Muslim, Christian, Hindu, who would agree with me on all of these topics. So just because the Holy Text says something, or just because people in a particular country in the Middle East, or just because people during the Crusades thought something or did something, doesn't mean that all of the people in that particular group should be painted with the one brush. So I think just first and foremost, it's important to treat people as individuals and find out what they think. And then if it turns out that they harbour a despicable view, fair enough, judge them then. I just would encourage people not to assume that if you're speaking to a Christian in the United States that you're automatically talking to someone who wants to take away your right to choose. I think that would be a mistake. There are undoubtedly Christians on both sides of that conversation, and just because you're speaking to a Muslim in a Muslim majority country, even though the statistics do demonstrate that the majority of them are anti-gay, that doesn't mean that the Muslim you're speaking to is necessarily anti-gay. They might very well be in favor of LGBTQ plus rights. And so all I would say in closing on this question is to treat people as individuals. That's certainly what I do. I don't judge anybody until I know a little bit more about them and what they believe and what they think. And sure enough, if they have despicable views, then I can judge them as despicable, but not until I know that. I just want to, you know, encourage people not to be tribal and not to make assumptions about people based upon their religious underpinnings or their religious background. And so with that said, let's move on to our next question. Thanks very much for submitting that, Big D. I appreciate it. My next question comes from one Bradley Scott, and Bradley writes, I know you've spoken a little on life after death as it applies to religion, but I wonder what your view is on the continuation of consciousness after death. With the advent of technologies such as AI and digital cloning, what do you think of the idea that we are creating our own afterlife? All the best, Bradley and Jessica. Well, thank you very much, Bradley and Jessica. I think it's a great question. It's a fascinating question. To be honest, Bradley and Jessica, this is a question that probably deserves a video of its own, but let me have a quick pass at it. I think the first thing that I need to mention here is that there is a distinction to be made between what we call in the study of religions objective immortality and subjective immortality. And your question really gets to the heart of these two ideas. Subjective immortality is when you yourself, your own personal consciousness, continues in some way, that you are personally aware of your survival after death because there is a continuity in your consciousness. Your subjectivity continues, hence the phrase subjective immortality, right? This is the kind of immortality that many Christians and Muslims believe in, for example, right? That you continue in some way and that you have an awareness of who you are and that you go to heaven and that you'll see your loved ones again and that you'll recognize them and they'll recognize you. This is a kind of subjective immortality, right? This is rather distinct from what is called objective immortality. And this is the idea that your consciousness could continue, but not in a subjective manner. And that's what you're talking about when you talk about AI and cloning and having your consciousness downloaded onto a hard drive, for example. If it were possible to take my consciousness, to take the electrical activity of my brain and to map it into an artificially intelligent system, to map it into a computer or a hard drive or something like that, and that was, you know, self-aware in some way, it's unclear whether or not that would include a kind of subjective continuation. That certainly wouldn't happen with cloning. If somebody took my body, just took a cell from my body and cloned a duplicate Magic Skeptic, I know that would be terrible. That would be a nightmare. There's enough in one of me. I'm annoying enough all by myself, aren't I? But if somebody were to clone me, that almost certainly wouldn't be a form of subjective immortality. You could continue cloning me till the end of time, and that way Magic Skeptic would continue to be alive in some form, but the original version of me that would have long since died wouldn't have any awareness of what's going on here. It would just be new versions of me being created, and that would be a form of objective immortality. So I think objective immortality is entirely and theoretically possible. We already know that cloning can be done. I mean, they cloned Dolly the sheep back in like the 90s or the 80s, wasn't it? I've forgotten the precise date, but suffice to say, a hell of a long time ago, we already, you know, figured out cloning. So it's just undeniable that human cloning is possible. So objective immortality is already feasible. It's already on the cards. It's just that people are quite squeamish about the idea of cloning. And I guess I get that. I mean, cloning is quite a step, right? I can see some amazing applications, however. Imagine you could clone a duplicate of me just without the consciousness, put me on life support, so then I have a replacement organ for every organ in my body. That would be a perfect match because it's a clone, right? I mean, what an amazing application that would be. Of course, the reason people are worried about that is, you know, with cloning, maybe there could be more scrupulous applications. I'm thinking right now about, I don't know, slavery. So we could just create a whole clone army of slaves. We could create a clone army. Shout out to Star Wars. right? So these things are terrifying, and they have some frightening applications, and like any technology, it can be used for good or it can be used for bad, but some of the positive applications just seem absolutely mind-blowing, and they seem like they would solve a lot of our problems, like, you know, organ donor waiting lists and things like that. And blood, imagine, you know, if we could just clone your blood, that would be just amazing, right? Then we wouldn't have any more, we wouldn't have any need for blood drives, and we wouldn't have to rely on the charity of and goodwill of strangers. We could just have an infinite supply if we needed it, right? So there's lots of amazing applications. But I digress. Back to your question, Bradley and Jessica. I think it's quite clear that objective immortality is not only possible, but it's a fact. Whether or not it'll become a digital reality, and whether or not it'll be possible to download our consciousnesses, is that I don't know, whether or not it'll be possible to download a consciousness to a computer remains to be seen. Maybe I mean, I'm not aware of that having been done. If it's been done, it's been done oblivious to me, but that seems possible. Whether or not it will ever happen, I don't know. But yeah, objective immortality is already on the cards, and that's clear. Subjective immortality, I'm afraid I'm not convinced. The idea that I'm going to continue in some way after I die seems completely ludicrous, and I see no evidence to support that whatsoever. The idea that my consciousness will continue would rely on the idea that my consciousness can exist independently of my body. My current consciousness, now remember, not a duplicate of my consciousness, not a digital download of my consciousness, but my current consciousness. The idea that that could survive my body. All of the evidence we have suggests that our consciousness is a byproduct of the brain, that it's an emergent property of the brain, and we know that upon death the brain dies. So the idea that my consciousness would continue in some way doesn't seem likely to me. Now, I'm not saying that that means it's been formally ruled out, you know. Who knows what the future holds? All I can tell you is that I don't currently believe that subjective immortality is possible. I don't currently believe that. And so I hope that addresses your question. So with the advent of technology such as AI and digital cloning, what do you think of the idea that we are creating, that we could create our own afterlife? Yeah, so I think I've addressed that. I think I've addressed the entire question. I hope that answer was satisfactory. Bradley and Jessica, thank you so much for submitting that question, and thank you for your continued support. Let's move on. The next question comes from one Paul Avant, and Paul writes, congrats on the 2K. Thank you very much, Paul. You certainly deserve it. Well, that means a lot, Paul. Thank you so much. My question is, do you believe there can be a true dichotomy when considering the descriptors of a god, i.e. omnipotence, omniscience, and so on? So I followed up. I just wanted clarification in order to answer this question, and I said, thanks, Paul. On the question, are you basically asking if God can break the laws of logic, like God could make something both true and false, thereby breaking the law of non-contradiction? To which Paul answered, yes, exactly. I know it's a somewhat debatable question, which pushes more towards theology, but I feel there could be some interesting discussion on the topic. So I think it's a fascinating question, Paul, and I do have some thoughts on this. So can God break the laws of logic? Is it possible for God to violate the laws of logic? Let's just take some baby steps first. Just for those of you who aren't familiar, it's obvious that Paul is familiar, but just in case anybody's not up to scratch on what we're talking about here. So there are three classical laws of logic: the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. These are basically descriptions about how reality operates. Summarized in a sentence, what they basically mean is something is what it is, it isn't what it isn't, and it can't be neither or both at the same time. What do I mean by that? An example will help. Let me just take something off the side press here. So this is a 50 pence piece of Her Majesty's finest sterling, a 50 pence piece, right? So if we apply these laws of logic, this 50 pence piece is a 50 pence piece. It's not a 50 pence piece, and it can't be neither or both at the same time. So it can't be a 50 pence piece and not a 50 pence piece at the same time. right? That's just a contradiction. That would violate the law of non-contradiction. It is a 50 pence piece and not a 50 pence piece. That's the law of identity. And it can't be neither or both at the same time. So in other words, the excluded middle. There's no middle ground between a true dichotomy. This either is a 50 pence piece or it isn't a 50 pence piece. In fact, that dichotomy applies to everything in the universe. Everything in the universe is either a 50 pence piece or it is not a 50 pence piece. Name any object you want, even an object hitherto undiscovered. That object is either a 50 pence piece or it is not a 50 pence piece. And it can't be neither or both at the same time. So this is just a very basic description about how reality operates, right? What Paul is asking me is if God could make it such that those rules were violated. Could God make it such that this 50 pence piece is and isn't a 50 pence piece at the same time? Is that possible? And some people might say, yes, it's possible because God can do anything. God can do the impossible. But the problem is there's a paradox. In order to say that God could do it, you're already assuming the laws of logic. If you were to suggest that God could make this both a 50 pence piece and not a 50 pence piece at the same time, then what you'd be saying is that it is true that God can do that. And if something is true, it means it's not false, which is again another re-expression of the laws of logic. What you're saying is that it is true, which means it's not false. That's, again, law of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. You would be assuming truth. You would be assuming that this idea that God can do the impossible is true and not false. In order to make that statement, you're already assuming the laws of logic. So this is why it's impossible as far as I can tell. It is fundamentally impossible for God to violate the laws of logic. It would have to be true that he was violating them, but that would assume them. You would be assuming that it's both possible for God to create a 50 pence piece that is and isn't a 50 pence piece at the same time, but you would be saying that that is a true state of affairs, that God can create this impossible object, so that it is true and therefore not false that God can do the impossible, which again assumes the laws of logic. Now, if your head hasn't already exploded, dear listener, I hope that wasn't too perplexing. I've tried my best to make that as simple as I can, and please don't misunderstand, I'm not talking down. I just know that the laws of logic aren't everybody's cup of tea. I just finished reading a book on logic recently, so I'm riveted by the topic, but I'm just keenly aware that this isn't everybody's idea of a fun conversation, and I have no doubt that my analytics at this point in the video are going to go so if you're still here and you're still watching despite all the logic talk, well done. You're a true supporter of the Magic Skeptic channel. Oh man. Anyway, so Paul, back to your question, and I'll try and wrap a neat bow around this. Can God do the impossible? So is it possible for God to create a square circle? Is it possible for God to make this 50 pence piece both a 50 pence piece and not a 50 pence piece at the same time? No, I don't think so, because to be able to do so, God would already be assuming the laws of logic in the first place. This makes Christians and theists more generally very upset, by the way, because they like to pretend that God is the creator of the laws of logic. But you have to remember, God is bound by the laws of logic as well. You can't say God created the laws of logic. God is bound by the laws of logic. If you're going to say that God created the laws of logic, that means there was a point at which God hadn't created them. But the laws of logic would still apply at that point where he hadn't created them, because it would be true that he hadn't created them yet, which is to say it's true that they're not created, so it's not false, right? Which again is a re-expression of the law of identity. Something is what it is, it isn't what it isn't, so it's true, not false, and it can't be neither or both at the same time. It can't be neither true or false. It has to be one or the other, and it can't be both. So even if you're going to say that God created the laws of logic, you don't understand the laws of logic. You cannot possibly assert that God created the laws of logic. Any God, if there is one, would be equally bound by these laws. It doesn't make sense at all. Unless you're going to entertain absurdities, If you're going to say, oh yeah, but even though they applied before God created them, they still didn't exist because God hadn't created them yet. And even though that's true, I'm just going to say that the laws of logic don't exist yet, even though it's true and not false. So that's an expression of non-contradiction, excluded middle, and law of identity. But fine, no, they didn't exist though. So, they didn't exist until God created them, or, maybe they're synonymous with God. God and the laws of logic are synonymous. They're one thing and they're together. But then where's your evidence for that? It just becomes an absolute cluster FUCK. So yeah, I don't think God can do it, Paul. I think it's a nonsense to suggest otherwise. I think anybody who does so is going to have a real difficult battle on their hands. And so that is my answer to that question. I hope that makes sense. Can God make a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it? Ask a theologian. All I'll say in closing is that, to be fair to theists and to be fair to most sophisticated theologians, not even they anymore believe that God can do the impossible. What they'll say is that God can do anything that's logically possible. That God can only do what's logically possible. So if it's logically possible, then God can do it. Like creating the universe is logically possible, so God can do that. But creating a square circle, even a square circle the size of an atom, he can create the universe because there's no logical contradiction there. Can't create a square circle because there's a logical contradiction there, and God is bound by the laws of logic. Even sophisticated theologians acknowledge that in today's world. So I don't want to be accused of strawmanning theists. I'm just going to say that any theist who does try to suggest that God can do the impossible probably hasn't done their homework on the laws of logic, and if they haven't done that homework, might be best to avoid a conversation with them. I don't know how far you'll get. So yeah, anyway, just some advice for you there, Paul. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for your continued support. Let's move on to the next question. The next question comes from Kenneth Gorry, or Gory. I'm going to go with Gory. Kenneth writes, congratulations on reaching 2K subscribers. Well done and very much deserved. Well, thank you very much, Kenneth. That means a lot. And it's great to have you on board, my friend. Kenneth goes on to say, having watched your videos, you display impressive knowledge and a presentation style showing how comfortable you are with each topic. So I would be interested to hear how you prepared the script for your videos. Thank you. Kenneth, I hope you're not going to fall off your seat when I say this, but 99% of my videos, they're not scripted, my friend. That's the truth. On my goddaughter's life, that is the truth. I don't script my videos. There's some videos earlier in my channel when I first started podcasting. My very first podcast videos, I did one on sidekicks, one on free will, and that. These were my very first podcast videos. They were audio only. If you watch them on the channel, there's just a picture that says A Magician's Thoughts, which is the name of the podcast. But those were scripted. Some of the very, very earliest videos were scripted, but very, very quickly I realized something which you've pointed out in your question, by the way, and thank you very much for your gracious compliment about my knowledge and presentation style. I really mean that. Thank you so much for saying that. You don't have to be so kind. So it's awesome to hear such feedback. That means a lot. But yeah, I mean, very early I was using scripts, but as you pointed out, my presentation style is a rather comfortable one, and if you observe it, you'll see, Kenneth, that they're not scripted. My videos sometimes run over an hour long, and on average they're between 30 and 40 minutes perhaps, and it's just me talking in a stream of consciousness. If they were scripted and I was memorizing that, it would take me weeks to memorize scripts that long, right? It would probably take months to memorize scripts that long. I don't write scripts, generally speaking, Kenneth. I speak off the cuff in preparation for a video. The most I will do, and even this is a rarity, for some of the more complicated topics, I'll just write down 3 or 4 bullet points. This is what I want to talk about in this video, and that's it. I have 3 or 4 bullet points or some mental notes, and I just go for it. I stream of consciousness, and then I tidy it up in the edit. I don't always get to the end of a filming session without making mistakes. Sometimes I have to do a second take and I tidy it up in the edit a bit, but largely speaking, for the majority of my videos, it's just me talking stream of consciousness with a mental plan or a few bullet points that I've written down in advance. So I'm afraid I don't have any advice about how I prepare the script, because there isn't one for the most part. One of my most recent videos, I did a video essay on my intellectual hero, Christopher Hitchens. You can check that out in my back catalogue, folks, if you're interested. That was scripted because I wanted to do a proper professional video essay style video, because I'd never done one of those before, and I wanted to try my hand at it, not least because of the editing challenge and the kind of editorial challenge that's faced with such a project. But yeah, so that one was scripted. But generally speaking, videos like this Q&A, none of this is scripted. I just have the questions and I'm telling you what I think live, and it's edited to tidy up some of the trips and falls, or I'll trip over my words, or I'll draw a blank or something, and you know, that's fine. But yeah, just stream of consciousness, Kenneth. I wish I could give you more advice than that, my friend, but thank you again for your gracious and kind words. I sincerely appreciate it, and I'm sorry I couldn't have been more help. If you are interested in script writing, you'll have to look elsewhere for advice on that one, Kenneth. But again, thank you for submitting your question. I appreciate it. My next question comes from a rather interesting name. The name is It's Cash Banuka. Is that it? I'm just going to call you Cash. I hope that's okay. And Cash writes, "Hi, Magic Skeptic. Congrats on the 2K. Well, thank you very much. You completely deserve it. Thanks a lot, Cash. That means a lot. Thank you. My question is, what is the religion you think is the least likely to actually be true? P.S. I know you're an atheist. I'm just curious." Oh, man, that is such an interesting question. Which religion do I think is the least likely to actually be true? Let me take that question in reverse. What do I think is the most likely to be true? I think, just using Occam's razor here, I think the religion that would probably be most likely, just probabilistically, to be true would be the religion with the least number of commitments, the least number of complexities involved. And so maybe if by religion we're assuming theistic notions involving a god, because obviously there are religions that don't include a god concept, like Buddhism and so on. Let's just leave those aside for a moment, because that's just going to complicate issues. I think by definition, using Occam's razor, the most likely to be true would probably be deism. Deism, which is the belief that there is a god, but that god doesn't interact with us, doesn't answer prayers, doesn't send his only begotten son, doesn't send prophets that fly to heaven on a winged horse or any of that stuff. Just a god that created everything and then pissed off. That's probably the most likely to be true, given that it's, you know, it contains the least number of commitments. You don't have to believe in a trinity. You don't have to believe in a virgin birth. You don't have to believe in flying horses. You don't have to believe in turning water into wine or any of that stuff. You just need to believe that there's a creator that got everything started and then moved on. So that's probably the most likely to be true, just on Occam's razor alone. What is the least likely to be true? I'm trying to think what has the most commitments. I don't know, maybe Hinduism? I mean, at a layman's reading, I've read contradictory information on this, so apologies, dear listener, or if there's any Hindus listening, if I get this wrong, please jump into the comments below and let me know. But there are millions of gods in Hinduism, but then I've also read that there's not really millions of gods. They're all just iterations of the same Brahman, which is at the top of it all. So look, if indeed there are millions of gods in Hinduism, maybe that's the least likely to be true. Leave Hinduism aside. If it was just a toss-up between Islam and Christianity, maybe Christianity is less likely to be true because of the Trinity, which is a rather illogical idea that, you know, for example, and I've seen Muslims actually launch this critique, which is great. I love this, where they critique Christianity by saying, gods by definition are immortal, humans by definition are mortal. So the idea of a God-man in the form of Christ, somebody who Trinitarians will say is both fully human and fully divine, that violates the laws of logic. You cannot, again, going back to, you swear I put these questions in an order to make them useful. I haven't, honestly. This is just working out this way. But yeah, that violates the laws of logic. Again, that's going back to the 50 pence piece. It can't be both a 50 pence piece and not a 50 pence piece at the same time. So to say that Jesus is both fully human, and humans are mortal, and fully divine, and divine beings are immortal, that's just a contradiction, a logical contradiction. You can't both be human and not human at the same time. That just doesn't make sense. That's just basic law of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, right? And there is no middle ground, right? Excluded middle, because you can't be immortal and mortal at the same time. This is the problem, you see. You can't be mortal and immortal at the same time. And so, yeah, laws of logic make the Trinity concept deeply untrustworthy in my view. And I've seen some casuistry on this. You know, my favorite one is the ice cube. So like an ice cube in the process of melting in a hot room, it's ice, but because it's melting there's water, but because it's so hot some of the water is turning into steam and condensation. So you've got all three entities present in one object, right? You've got water, steam, and ice all together, all part of one, you know, central self core thing, but having different expressions. The problem is that the water that is water is not ice anymore, and it's not yet steam. So that doesn't violate the laws of logic. And this is what makes it a bad analogy. Christ is both fully human and fully divine simultaneously. You wouldn't suggest to me that the ice is both water, ice, and steam all at once. It isn't. You wouldn't say to me that liquid water is ice and liquid at the same time, because it isn't, right? So the analogy fails, unfortunately. But yeah, if we were just comparing those two, perhaps Christianity is less likely to be true. The least likely to be true out of the pair of those. Just give you one other comparison that comes to mind. If we were to compare Catholicism with Protestantism, or certain forms of Protestantism at least, let's take Anglicanism in the UK, I would say that Catholicism is the least likely to be true there. Again, there are fewer commitments in Anglicanism. Anglicanism, for example, does not maintain that the transubstantiation is a literal one. In other words, Church of England goers don't believe that the bread and wine literally turn into the body and blood of Christ. They believe that it's just a representation. Whereas the Catholic Catechism teaches that the bread and wine literally turn into the body and blood of Christ, which makes, in my view, again, according to Occam's razor, it makes English or British Protestantism, it makes Anglicanism much more likely to be true by default. So I've given you some sense of an answer to that question. It's hard to compare all the religions, Cash, but a very interesting question all the same. I hope that gives you a sense about my thoughts about the likelihood, using Occam's razor there, which is to say that the simplest answer is usually the best one, or in other words, the proposition that has the fewest commitments, the proposition that has the fewest moving parts is more likely to be true than the one that has vastly more moving parts, right? So I hope that gives you some food for thought. And with that addressed, thank you very much for your question, Cash, and let's move on to the next one. Our next question comes from a name that I may struggle with, so I apologize in advance if I butcher this, but the name is, according to my reading, Atharva Sahu. So I hope I got that right, Atharva. And I'm going to struggle with this. Atharva writes, congrats on 2K. Thank you very much, Atharva. Please guide me on guessing ATM and crush names that mentalists perform. Read many books, but still unable to do it. If required, I can contact you another way. So this is a vestige of the past of my channel. So I am the magic skeptic, and for those of you who didn't know and haven't dived into my back catalogue, the word magic isn't there just to sound cool or snazzy, albeit maybe it just sounds cheap and rotten, I don't know, but it's not there for no reason. I am in fact a practicing magician, and I perform semi-professionally, and so yeah, this channel began as a repository of all things magic. And if you go back and look at my back catalogue, there are videos of me doing street magic, videos of me reading people's minds, which is what Atharva is referring to here, reading people's minds and getting their PIN codes to their phones and their bank cards and things like this. When I say reading people's minds, I'm not saying I'm actually reading their minds. It's obviously magic. It's all illusion, and that there are, of course, and what Atharva is asking about, there are techniques that can be learned that will help one gain access to such information in a way that the spectator is oblivious to, and so it really feels like their mind is being read. So my channel began as a repository for all things magic, but it transitioned into philosophy after my appearance on the Sergeant Ducky podcast. Shout out to Sergeant Ducky. Sergeant Ducky has been an enormous help in terms of the growth of my channel and, you know, giving me shout outs and things. So I couldn't make a 2,000 subscriber video without a shout out to Ducky. So again, shout out to you, Ducky. Thank you very much for all of your help and assistance. But when I appeared on Sergeant Ducky's podcast for the very first time, just as a kind of an offbeat remark, I said at the end of the podcast that I was thinking about starting my own podcast. And I was thinking about calling it A Magician's Thoughts On. That podcast became just A Magician's Thoughts. And that has now graduated into my latest podcast series, which is The Most Annoying Religious People. But yeah, just as a kind of off-the-cuff remark, I asked his audience, would anybody be interested in a magician's thoughts on various topics, be it like psychics, mediums, philosophy, God, religion, etc., etc. And to my surprise, there was quite a reaction to that. There were a lot of people that jumped into the comments who said they'd love to listen to such a podcast. And so that was the genesis of it right there, a simple off-the-cuff remark. And my channel transitioned from being a magic channel primarily to now being a channel about all things philosophy and skepticism. And I've spoken at length in the past about the connection between magic and skepticism. I think they're intimately connected. You know, magicians are experts in deception and how to fool people. And when you study the arguments for God's existence, those arguments can have deceptive yet intuitively persuasive ideas built into them. And so my view is that just like a magician is searching for the trap door in a magic trick, or that they'll be able to see the trapdoor or be able to recognize the sleight of hand that the performer is using, in the same way that a magician does that, I think a philosopher in the study of religions and a person who studies epistemology and the nature of fallacious reasoning can get quite good at discovering the deception that exists within argumentation. So, speaking metaphorically, it's possible by studying philosophy and the nature of fallacious reasoning, and by studying epistemology and logic and so on, it's possible to discover, proverbially speaking, the trap door or the invisible string or the hidden magnet or the false bottom in somebody's argument, right? And so that's the connection I see between the two. But I digress. Back to Atharva's question. Atharva wants some insight into how I perform these feats of mind reading and how I gain access to those pin codes when I read people's minds. I can't give you the method, Atharva, because I'm not the inventor of these methods, and so it would be dishonest, disingenuous, and immoral for me to give away somebody else's intellectual property. What I can do is guide you to research certain things, which will eventually and ultimately lead to your discovery of the truth behind these performances. So two things I would encourage you to look up. One is cold reading. So look up cold reading. This is the art of, it appears like you're giving very sincere, direct, detailed and complex readings and telling people things about themselves that you couldn't have possibly known. It is the art of creating that illusion. Right, that's what cold reading is. You need to look into that. And something else you need to look into is called the art of pre-show. And if you Google that phrase, the art of pre-show, there was a book that was published just recently, actually, the name of which I've forgotten, the author of which I've forgotten. I'll put it on the screen, actually. I'll include the link in the description below if you're interested. But the art of pre-show is something you need to look into as well. If you look into cold reading and the art of pre-show, and if you also look into a great starter book for any budding mentalist who wants to get into mind reading, the starter book that is recommended to most magicians is The 13 Steps to Mentalism. It's an excellent book that I couldn't recommend more highly, and again, I'll include a link in the description below. Now, just to be clear, Atharva, I'm not telling you, Atharva, rather, I'm not telling you that that book will necessarily contain answers to how I did the effects that I did in those videos where I read people's minds and get their pin codes and so on. But if you study cold reading, if you study the 13 Steps to Mentalism, and if you study pre-show work, you'll be able to take those techniques to create illusions that are the same. And if you become a student of this subject and take it very, very seriously and go down that rabbit hole, you'll become a far better mentalist than I am. I mean, there's no question about it. So it's going to take some hard work and effort. The reason we don't give out answers to how this stuff is done, obviously, is because it's not our intellectual property to give away, which would make it immoral. You're supposed to pay for these secrets. That's like magic is a business like any other, and so I'm not going to give away somebody else's intellectual property. But more than that, another reason we don't give it away, even if it was my intellectual property, we don't just give it away to somebody who's asking in a YouTube comment thread, because I don't know who you are. I don't know how dedicated you are. I don't know if I tell you, are you just going to make a YouTube video where you tell it to everybody, and give it away to lay people who aren't muggles, if you will, in the Harry Potter universe, people who aren't in the magic community, because this happens quite a bit where people get interested in magic for a month, and if magicians are foolish, they'll give away trade secrets, and then that person leaves the domain after having been in it for only a month, and then they go and they give away all those secrets, or tell all their loved ones, or upload YouTube videos to get cheap clicks and cheap views while they give away somebody else's intellectual property, which is just the height of immorality, in my opinion. So I hope that gives you some sense of how to go about your journey and learning the secrets, Atharva. But with all that said, let's move on to our next question. Thank you very much for submitting that one, Atharva. I appreciate it. So my next question comes from one Callum Bursher. Callum is both a subscriber and a patron, so thank you very much, Callum, for submitting a question. Callum submits his question via video, which is a privilege that I give to my patrons, and Callum has availed himself of that privilege. So without further ado, let's hear from Callum, and then I'll dive right in and give you my response. Take it away, Callum.
Hello, Magic Skeptic. Just wanted to say thank you for all the videos that you do. They're brilliant and well done on hitting 2,000 subscribers. I'm thrilled for you, mate. The videos, they always teach me something, whether it be the different arguments between free will and determinism, or simply what Mickey means in Ireland. It's fantastic. The question I have for you is, what's next for the channel? Different series, videos, ideas, merchandise possibly in the future. What's the plan? How do you go from amazing? How do you push up the ceiling once you've already hit the ceiling, is what I'm trying to say. Well then, mate, keep up the good work.
If you're not sure what Callum is referring to with his use of the word Mickey, I am not going to explain it again in this podcast, because I've explained it far too many times, especially when PJ from the channel Just the Tip calls around for a visit. Mickey is a colloquialism in Ireland that has a very particular meaning. I recommend you Google it if you're interested, dear listener. So with that said, Callum, I'm really and truly humbled by your video submission. You are far too kind. I sincerely appreciate it, honestly. And to be honest, guys, I'm just inundated with the, inundated maybe is the wrong word. I'm just overcome. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of praise and compliments that you guys have submitted in this Q&A. I mean, thank you so much. It really makes it all worthwhile, because, guys, I mean, I have a real kind of like, I don't want to say self-hatred, but like every now and then I'll make a video and I'm about to upload it and I feel like it's just a piece of crap. And I feel like, oh man, I'm losing it. I'm not myself. I'm not doing too well. And then sure enough, I upload it and you guys dive in, week out, every week without fail. And you give me a reason to make another video. I mean, I know other YouTubers say this all the time and it is something of a cliche, but guys, it really is true. I wouldn't be able to do this without you guys. I wouldn't be able. I really wouldn't be able to do this without you guys. Because sometimes I lose belief in myself, and then I upload the next video. I summon the willpower from somewhere, or there is no free will, as Callum inferred, but the willpower comes from somewhere. I don't know, but for some reason I upload the next video, and then the praise and the adoration and the support that I get from you guys gives me a kind of a little bit of a boost. And reading these questions and answering them in this Q&A at this juncture in the growth of my channel, you guys are just blowing me away. And so, Callum, thank you so much for your kind words. But getting to your question, what are the next steps for the channel? Merchandise. I'm definitely going to look into merchandise at some point. I haven't done it yet. I mean, I will. There's definitely a few ideas I have for t-shirts and cups and things like that. It would be nice. I want to make a t-shirt for those of you who watched any of my freedom of speech videos and so on. I would definitely like to make a t-shirt that says FUCK, the Public Order Act, the Section 5 of the Public Order Act that forbids free speech here in the UK. So Section 5 of the Public Order Act. I'd love to make that t-shirt and get people wearing it in the UK and start a bloody revolution, man. Another t-shirt I'd like to make, because it's something that I've said quite a bit. I've said it numerous times, but the majesty of the universe is enough for me. That would be a really nice t-shirt as well. And another one I had in mind is, if I'm wrong, I want to know. I like that as well. That's something I've said quite a few times. But yeah, I've got lots of ideas for merchandise. So watch this space. Don't expect anything anytime soon. I'm still just trying to do the legwork of getting the channel mainstream. 2,000 subscribers is a great milestone. I'm very, very happy to be here. But, I want 10,000 subscribers. I want 20,000 subscribers. I want to get up there. And with the help of people like you, Callum, and all the others who have submitted questions in this video, I'll get there eventually. But in terms of other plans, I have plans for other series of videos. Now, before I say anything, before I open my mouth in what I'm about to tell you here, please don't interpret anything I'm saying here as a plan that's set in stone. Everything I'm about to say here is purely in the hypothetical stage. It's purely in the maybe I'll do it, maybe I won't stage. So anything I tell you here is subject to either happen or not happen. So please remember that. With that in mind, I have an idea for a series of videos which will be called The Most Annoying Atheists. So I want to make a corollary series, in other words, to run alongside my Most Annoying Religious People series, because I don't want to be accused of being biased, and there are many atheists out there who make terrible arguments, and I want to address those arguments just as much as I want to address the arguments of theists. So that's one idea I have in mind. Another idea I have in mind is for a series where I go out and do some kind of like street epistemology, where I talk to people on the street about why they believe in God, and maybe have an over and back kind of like a change my mind segment or something like that. That's something else I have in mind. There's a few other ideas, but they're so early in gestation in my mind that I won't share them with you now. But that's just a couple of ideas, my friend, that I have in mind. Other than that, my plan for the immediate future of the channel is to just keep meeting my upload deadline. Uploading one video a week is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, if any of you are running a channel out there, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but it's just so exhausting. The amount of work that goes into this, between filming, editing, the conceptualization of the videos and so on, just coming up with the idea and finding the videos I'm going to react to and so on. There's an enormous amount of work attached. And so trying to balance that with my full-time job, trying to balance that with my gym attendance, trying to balance that with my social life and my life with my fiance and so on, it's a tall order. So getting that one video up per week is really my number one focus, and that's going to be my number one focus for some time. When the channel eventually reaches such a mainstream point where it becomes financially viable, where I can perhaps reduce the part-time work, then I will plan to perhaps increase the number of videos that I output, maybe up to 2 videos per week. So that's something else that I have on the back burner, Callum, but it's going to take some time for that to happen. But with all that said, Callum, thank you again for submitting your question. I sincerely appreciate it. You are an incredibly generous patron, and I'm very, very lucky to have you supporting me. And just not from Magic Skeptic to a subscriber or to a patron, but just from one human to another, thank you, my friend. And with that said, let's move on to the next question. And the final question in this Q&A, this historic 2,000 subscriber Q&A of yours truly, Magic Skeptic, comes from one Goose. And Goose writes, acting depressed is a choice, quote unquote. Emphasize on the acting doing depressing things. I'd like to hear what you think about this. I was a little confused about this question, so I followed up by asking the following. Are you asking if it's possible for depressed people to choose their way out of depression? To which Goose said, that's not what I was thinking, but I think that's actually a better question for a Q&A. That was Goose's response, so I'm not entirely sure what Goose meant by their first comment. So look, I'm just going to dive right in here with the interpretation that I had of the question. So is it possible for depressed people to choose their way out of depression? And any of you who are long-time viewers of my channel, you already know what I'm going to say here. There is no free will. We don't choose our next thought. If it were possible to choose one's way out of depression, depression wouldn't exist. Who'd choose that? What? If only it were that simple. I mean, I'm not going to say this as some kind of bombshell admission. I've made a podcast, a full podcast if you're interested, about depression that I recorded with my good friend PJ from the channel Just the Tip. And if you want to hear our thoughts, both of our thoughts in full on depression, you can listen to that. It's actually well worth listening to. It's one of my favorite podcasts on my channel. But yeah, suffice to say, I've had my run-ins with depression. PJ has. Everybody does. Depression is not some unique thing. I always remember one time in school, and I hope you won't think of me as mean-spirited for this, dear listener, but I had a student one time say to me, they came up to me at the beginning of the lesson, and they said, "Sir, just so you know, I'm suffering from depression." And they delivered it like they had murdered someone. "Just so you know, I've killed a man." And this is just hilarious to me. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not hilarious to me that the child is suffering from depression. That's awful. And, you know, my sympathy was with that child, and I helped them the best way I could. I hope you would know that about me without me having to even confirm it, dear listener. I'm not an unsympathetic, careless, or crude individual in that way. I try my best to help people when I can. But what was hilarious to me about it is that they delivered it in this way. They delivered this piece of information as though it were some kind of bombshell announcement. Like, they said it as though I should have dropped to the floor and been like, "Oh my God, no, not you." You know? Like, it's just a bizarre thing. Like, I think people kind of get wrapped up in their own mind, and they think that depression is this really kind of special, unique and rare thing, and it isn't. I think everybody deals with it to one extent or another. It's just life. It just is what it is, right? And considering how common it is, and considering how much it sucks when it hits you bad, and when it hits me bad, as I described on that podcast with PJ, I don't even want to get out of bed. I just want to pull the blankets over my head and stay there, and I just want the world to disappear. When I suffered with depression, which I did quite badly when I first moved to England, because I had left my family and my then girlfriend, now fiance, behind, and I stayed in England for 2 years by myself. That was an incredibly difficult undertaking, but I had to do it because I wasn't willing to teach in Ireland, where I was going to have to force and jam religion down the throats of children. So I sacrificed and I moved to England, and despite all of the emotional turmoil and depression that came with that, I stuck it out. I'm not looking for praise here, dear listener. I'm just trying to be honest with you about what happened. But during that time, I suffered very, very badly from depression, and oh goodness, if it were possible to choose your way out of it, I would have chosen out of that in a second. I would have chosen to not be depressed in a nanosecond. I think the same is true of every other individual. We don't choose our next thought. We can't even unchoose a song that's stuck in our heads. Why else do we even have that phrase? Why do people complain about songs getting stuck in their heads if we can choose our next thought? So for any of you who think that there's free will and we can choose our next thought, please reflect on these realities. Why can't depressed people choose not to be depressed? Why can't one choose to unthink a song that's stuck in their head? Why can't people choose to unthink negative thoughts? I went through a period of time that I'm happy to say is past, where because I love my fiance and adore her so much, and because she is the light of my life, and because she defines my existence, I went through a period of having terrible visions of her dying. This wasn't even while I was asleep. I was just plagued with waking thoughts of her being enveloped in a fire or dying horrendously and bleeding out in a car crash and all this kind of stuff. And these thoughts just would not let me alone. They would not let me be. If I could choose not to think them, I would have had. But thankfully, they passed on their own. All I can say is that when I suffer from depression, when it creeps into my psychology and rears its ugly head, I accept the reality of determinism. Not willingly, of course. I have come to accept it through a deterministic process. Reason is deterministic, by the way. Becoming convinced of something is never a choice. And if that were the case, I want you to choose right now to believe that this is not a 50 pence piece, but that it is actually an orange. choose to believe that this 50p piece is an orange. If beliefs are choices, then you should be able to change that belief right now. Believe that this is an orange. And please notice, dear listener, that no matter how many times you tell yourself it's an orange, it's an orange, it's an orange, it's an orange, it won't become true in your psychology. You will still be hopelessly, deterministically convinced that this 50p piece is a 50p piece. Because our beliefs are not choices. They are determined by the evidence that is before your eyes. They are determined by indoctrination. They are determined by a whole host of factors that are completely outside of your control. So, your beliefs are not choices. The fact that you're depressed is not a choice. You can't choose to escape depression. You can't choose to unthink that song that's tormenting you. And I was unable to choose to unthink those terrible thoughts that I was having about my fiance. They stayed for as long as they stayed, and they left whenever they left. I'm not attributing agency to them, by the way. When I say they left, I mean it in the same kind of way that an ice cube leaves on a hot summer's day. There's some kind of a natural psychological process by which thoughts dissipate. But yeah, so getting back to the point I was making, for whatever reason, and however I became convinced of this, I no longer fight my depressing thoughts when they occur. I accept them. I have become convinced deterministically that accepting them is the best policy, because I can't unthink them. I can't choose for those thoughts to go away. All I can do is accept them and wait for them to pass. And I kid you not, dear listener, and I'm not a psychiatrist and I'm not a counselor, so don't take this as professional advice. If you're suffering from depression, you need to call a mental health care expert, not me. But all I can tell you is that as soon as I accepted the truth of determinism, and as soon as I accepted that my depression is involuntary and that I have no choice or control over it, it's now much less painful. It's much less unpleasant. It now comes and it stays for as long as it stays, and it goes. And those depression episodes are now much easier to deal with, and they're much less oppressive because I've accepted them. And funnily enough, I was speaking to somebody else with depression recently, and they were reading literature on this. And again, this is not professional advice, but they said that this particular insight that I happened across by myself is the exact same advice that was given in a peer-reviewed document that they were reading about depression. That the best thing to do is to accept the thoughts for what they are and allow them to pass in time, and to not try and wrestle with them, and to accept them as the thoughts that they are, and that a thought is a thought and nothing more. This is also a facet of cognitive behavioral therapy, that you just accept that a thought is a thought and nothing more, that a thought isn't necessarily a reality, it's just a psychological disposition, and psychological dispositions pass. And so, yeah, I've seen confirmatory evidence of the point of view that I have arrived at through this deterministic reasoning process. But again, please remember that none of this should be taken as advice. If you're suffering with your mental health, you need to see a healthcare professional about that, and not trust some YouTuber called Magic Skeptic who makes philosophy videos, right? So in answer to the question, can depressed people choose the way out of depression? No, I don't think so. But you don't have to. It's totally possible to deal with it and live with it using other methods. We don't need free will to defeat depression, in my view. And yeah, I hope that answers the question that we did decide on answering, Goose. Apologies for not understanding your initial question. Perhaps you can reformulate it and I'll answer the question that you initially intended in a future Q&A. But with that said, guys, we've reached the end. This is my 2,000 subscriber Q&A conversation. I hope it lived up to your expectation. I hope that those of you who asked questions appreciated the answers I gave. I've tried my best to dedicate a lot of time to each question. And to those of you who didn't submit a question but sat around and listened and watched anyway, thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate it. And I hope to read and answer your questions in the next Q&A. So just before we wrap up, an extra special thank you to my patrons. You guys are amazing. It is really your generosity that keeps this channel afloat. You guys are the best. And so if you want to become a patron like those I mentioned, you'll find the description, or rather you'll find the link in the description below. And yeah, thank you very much for watching this video, everybody, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.